Ladies and gentlemen,
I am eager to introduce this second day of the Euro-Asian Economic Forum from Verona to Istanbul this year. This is the edition number 18, and we'll have another important and depth day for reflections, analysis, and declaration about the situation worldwide. Starting from the special condition of this country, that is the Turkey, that is the real crossroad in a many issues, economic, industrial, energetical, geopolitical, and that's why we are anxious to start this second day. First of all, before to introduce our special guests, please see the small video that we prepared for it. Thank you.
Eurasia is the world's main economic engine. Despite rising global geopolitical tensions, economic ties across the region are expanding, and cooperation among many Eurasian countries continues to grow. New international infrastructure, industrial and logistics projects are emerging, and trade between nations is increasing. Eurasia is home to 5 billion people, thousands of cities, and countless active connections among entrepreneurs, policymakers, and societies. But cooperation doesn't happen on its own. It is built by companies and governments, banks and universities, cultural and civic organizations. The Verona Eurasian Economic Forum provides a space for dialogue across many fields, bringing together East and West. Here, people from across Eurasia meet to strengthen economic and cultural ties and to promote collaboration. Welcome to the 18th Verona Eurasian Economic Forum.
So let us begin. I'm very happy to introduce our two guests for this special session that opens the second day of works of the forum. Professor Romano Prodi, please join us on the stage. Professor Romano Prodi, an economist, twice president of Italy in 1996 and 2006. He was also president of the European Commission in the first 5 years of this millennium. And we'll go back to that creative stage for the European Union. He was also the CEO of the largest industrial holding in Italy, which controlled 60-70% of the Italian industry. For 2 periods, he economically managed the development of Italy. And this is one of the reasons why I believe he's been invited once again to the forum to take the floor. The second special guest of this morning is Professor Necmeddin Bilal Erdogan, whom again I invite to join us here. Bilal Erdogan is chairman of the Ilim Yayma Foundation, a long-standing institution with a long history here in Turkey. Mr. Erdogan perfectly understands Italy because he studied in Italy for a few years in Bologna. And so it will be easy to communicate. Of course, he's free to choose the language he would like to use to give his answers. English, Turkish, Italian, but it will be easy for all of us to handle and chair. It will be easy for me in particular to chair this session using Italian. Now let's start from a topic that gives a framework of the whole context where we are. I am referring to the current situation of the world the context that we are dealing with at a complex time of different and stratified crises. The world is trying to find a turning point or the key to face the most threatening dangers. I am referring in particular to the relationship between the two economic superpowers of the world. We just a few hours before the end in South Korea of the much-awaited meeting between the American president and the Chinese president, President Prodi, has long supported the idea that any meaningful, relevant decision at the global level must and will depend on an agreement between China and the United States. So here's my first question, Professor Prodi. What do you think of how the meeting is going in Busan in South Korea? At the end of the meeting, both Trump and Xi Jinping claimed a successful meeting and claimed that the trade war with tariffs was getting to a successful solution. Well, first of all, thank you very much. First of all, thank you very much for the invitation. I am extremely happy to be here at this forum, which has always been a place of spontaneous freedom and of true dialogue. I'm also very happy to be here with Professor Erdogan. It's a great pleasure. Life is a bit odd, you know. I only found out this morning that he lived 100 meters away from a house in Bologna, and we never met. We're meeting here in Istanbul for the first time. So I'm very happy that this is happening. This is life. Coming to your question, one thing is clear. In recent times, the world is showing a strong dualism between the United States and China. We've seen a huge transformation in recent times. Based on the latest meetings, we can see an acknowledgement by the United States of the role of China. Now, this is an extremely important change. The day before yesterday, there was a meeting which was symbolically very important. If we look at all the comments, the first thing we read is that this is one of the rare cases where the main actors didn't make any declarations. It could be good, it could be bad, but I think it makes interpreting what happened even more complicated. The tariff war is calming down, not because they found an agreement, but because both parties realized that they both had such powerful weapons that they would damage the counterpart without gaining particular benefits. On the one hand, the weapon of rare lands, rare materials, solar power. On the other, the superiority of last generation chips. So the compromise has been found in postponing the confrontation. So this delaying, this postponing has been used as a tool to calm things down. And this is certainly a step forward, a tangible progress. On the other topics, well, they stated they wouldn't talk about Taiwan, which they didn't, but they also stated they talked about Ukraine for a long time. But there was no statement on this specific topic. My interpretation is that, but it's my own interpretation, because no statements were made, but my interpretation is that saying that they talked a lot about Ukraine is a positive step forward for a future agreement on the issue. But I'm being cautious here because we need to be very mindful of the words and language that we can use. They had planned the meeting for months. They finally did meet, and the intention is to meet once again next year. Probably Trump will travel to China, and then Xi Jinping will visit Trump in the United States. What does this all mean? Well, I think this lays the foundation for what we might call an agreement in world politics. How this will then be implemented in detail, it's hard to say, also because the current American president is completely different from his predecessors. President Trump has no trust in Europe whatsoever. Look, this is a dramatic shift. I was born and I grew with a natural relationship and tie to the United States in terms of soft power and hard power, music, theater. This is my background, technology, a strong connection to the United States. And this current approach by the United States, ignoring Europe, I believe is first a big change and a mistake. We'll talk about it later, but Europe currently is almost paralyzed. And that's on this that I would like to come back to. But first, I'd like to ask a question to Professor Erdogan. In this vision portrayed by Professor Prodi, there are these two poles using dissuasion, namely tariffs, not to hurt each other. During the Cold War, nuclear power was used as a deterrent. Now they're using a fiscal deterrent. What is the perspective of Turkey? Turkey, given its geographic location and history, we said it over and over again, is a bridge between two worlds, between the West and the East, between Europe and Asia. Now, I wonder, this revolution just described by Professor Prodi, this change in the hierarchies governing the world, for a growing country like Turkey, a country that is becoming more and more central because it's part of NATO, because it's part of BRICS, because it looks at Squad. Well, I wonder, in this context, does Turkey see opportunities for its own development, and does it see the possibility for greater stability and less conflicts? Thank you very much, Professor Prodi, and thank you to the Eurasian Forum for organizing this event. I don't have a lot of experience in speaking in Italian in front of a crowd, and so I'd rather switch to English for today.
And thank you for having me here today. Of course, Turkey historically has been at the crossroads of civilizations, from Europe to Asia. Our history spans from our migrations from Asia to Europe, and we have made Anatolia a homeland 1,000 years ago. And obviously throughout that history we have accumulated this experience of dealing with all those civilizations and powers around us. You know, at certain points it was Persia, at certain times it was the Arabs, at certain times it was Europe, and still that story continues. But before going into that, as an opening remark, I want to talk about the circumstances of this Verona Forum, because it is the 18th version now, 18th time it's being held, and it was always held in Verona, of all the places, the city of love, right? Unfortunately, all that love is lost for Verona Forum now, so you cannot hold it in Verona anymore, unfortunately, because I think this forum knows very well the double standards this world is holding against us and you and the Russians, I guess. There is a war continuing up north, and we are very much used to wars around us as Turkey. But we see the sanctions that are placed not only on the Russian government, not only on Russian businesses, even the Russian athletes and artists are facing these unjust sanctions. They cannot go compete, they cannot take part in events. There is a genocide unfolding to the south of us. Israel is under, it's now well documented, and even international bodies objectively have decided that this is a genocide. But we don't see a glimpse of those sanctions being placed on Israel, unfortunately. And this is, as Turkey, we find ourselves in the midst of these two challenges. We are friends to the both sides of the Russian-Ukrainian conflict, and it's hard as it is already, because we don't want to lose Russia, we don't want to lose Ukraine. Both are very important partners and neighbors of Turkey, economically, historically, socially. I mean, these are very close countries to us. And obviously, Palestinian people, we hold very dear to us. We share the same religion, we share the same geography. We used to rule over those lands for 5 centuries. And now there is genocide unfolding there, and the West is unfortunately implementing these double standards when it comes to dealing with Russia and when it comes to dealing with Israel. And this is so frustrating. I'm also a head of World Ethnosport Union, in which we try to popularize traditional sports in the world. We have, even in the last 2 festivals that we held in Istanbul, we hosted Sicilian folk dances in Istanbul also. So we have Italian participation in our events. As a sports sort of executive, I see this trauma being unfolded in our eyes, I mean in front of our eyes. Why can Russian athletes not compete, and why can Israeli teams still compete everywhere? And international bodies are doing everything in their power to accommodate Israeli teams, even sometimes to the disadvantage of the competing rival. And so I hope Verona Forum can continue holding these forums in its rightful place in Verona, and I hope, and these double standards also reflect, as someone who has lived in Italy for about 4 or 5 years, in America for about 10 years, by the way. So I have had a chance to understand both the American version of the West and the European version of the West. You see a lack of strategic vision in Europe. This is so deep now. I mean, we saw this in Turkey's EU accession process. In 2004, 21 years ago, and Professor Prodi will remember all this very, because he was in many of the processes at the helm. There was a referendum on Cyprus. In Cyprus, people of Cyprus voted for the Annan Plan in 2004. The Greek Cypriots in the south said no, Turkish Cypriots in the north said yes. Despite this outcome, even though the Turkish Cypriots voted yes for a plan to resolve the conflict on the island, the EU continued to admit Greek Cypriots as the sole authority on the island. This was against European law, this was against European criteria, and there you have the issue not resolved because of the strategic lack of vision from the Europeans. This was one important example also on the Turkish psyche. You know, we remember it very clearly. And, you know, you can put forward many examples where this trust was lost. Now, talking about EU membership of Turkey is increasingly a dream vision. You know, Turkey is still very much a European country. We have been trading with Europe in Venice, in the Piazza San Marco, right? The square in Venice. You see Turkish traders from 5 centuries ago coming to Venice and trading with the Italians. We are in European politics for 500 years. Ottoman Navy lived in Nice for 9 months during Suleiman Magnificent to protect the French from the Germans. I mean, so by every measure, Turkey is so much European, but because of this lack of vision, Europe is unfortunately limiting its future potential. It is already demographically under threat. There are already challenges economically against Europe's prospects. That is why I see in this day, you know, when America under the leadership of Trump trying to create a new vision for America in the under the guise of a threat from China to the superiority of the United States, we see no leadership to compete that coming from American President Trump. So I think Turkey is going to be obviously here with our European neighbors and friends. And we are still living through the same struggles that Europe is facing, you know, in the face of the transformation of the power play globally. I believe that we can handle it better together. I mean, this is sort of my proposal here today. And this lack of vision and lack of leadership is costing, I think, our European friends, and it needs to change, and it needs to change quickly. And I hope Italian public opinion and Italian business ecosystem can put pressure from the south to Brussels for that.
Come avete sentito, il professor Erdogan.
As we've heard, Professor Erdogan has criticized Europe and its political leadership, especially in Brussels. When the euro was created and when the enlargement was performed under the Prodi Commission, I remember the debate on the possibility of Turkey joining the EU. Some people were leaving the door open to this accession, especially Professor Prodi, considering the importance and the relevance of a country like Turkey and the role that it could have played for the Europe, including 50 members back then, and some people were very against it. And Turkey in 2002, Europe closes its door to Turkey, then therefore Turkey will open up other doors looking elsewhere. And I remember very well this situation, and it actually developed just like it was promised. Turkey did find itself a space in geopolitical terms and economic terms without the European Union. So the question is for Professor Prodi, what happened in Brussels? What do I mean? So in the years when you were not there, choices were made that were absolutely not substantial, and then other choices were made that were very counterproductive. For example, 5 years ago, not 25, but 5 years ago, the EU could count on a strategic alliance that you mentioned with the American ally, in a strategic economic agreement signed by Macron and Merkel with China, and an extraordinary and stable and low-cost supply of energy from Russia. But within just 3 years, Europe was able to close all of these three agreements, and it damaged itself and its own security, especially in economic, financial, and energy terms, therefore damaging its own development perspectives. It's like as if the EU had performed a harakiri, a suicidal act. So what led the EU and the European Commission to doing such a harmful act? Well, this has been a progressive trend, one mistake after another, one step away after another. So it's difficult to define one moment. And I lived through this as a protagonist. I remember when it came to a dialogue to Turkey, my stand was very simple. We need to begin this dialogue, and it will require some time, but in the future we will get there. And I remember that friends from the Turkish TV would ask me, why do we need so much time? And the answer was very simple. Well, history had separated us. And so back then we needed to bring governments together, but not only governments, also people together. And then there were a number of international factors that brought about this very strong separation. Now, the situation is very clear. We are talking about an EU enlargement, but quite frankly, I say that I see that the EU is paralyzed on this simply because with 27 members and their veto power and the fact that institutions and their structures are not changing, the EU cannot enlarge itself. So, and quite frankly, I'll say that when I carried out the enlargement of the EU, and it is interesting to point out that we included 8 countries belonging to the former Soviet Union, and we had absolutely no problem with Russia. The agreement was perfect. With President Putin, the agreement was perfect. And he would tell me, I have no problem with the EU, do whatever you want. My problem is with NATO, not with the EU. But at the same time, every European country was willing to change the unanimity rule. So they said, together with enlargement, we will change the rules that manage our being together. And that didn't happen. Now the paralysis is due to this unanimity rule. So major decisions, including foreign affairs policies, major decisions have to be taken with unanimity, and you can't even manage a building, an apartment building, with this kind of rule. And that is the dramatic truth. That's the problem. Some countries believe that going back to tradition and to the past is essential. in order to go towards the future. And my country is included in this group. Italy does not agree with the abolition of the unanimity rule, which, as I said, results in a paralysis. That's the situation. And it would be very simple to just solve this and relaunch Europe if we were just to apply the rule that applies in all normal democratic traditions. The majority decides. From the following day, we would have no paralysis anymore. But we still have it for the reasons I just mentioned. And then what happened in the world? It might seem like a side comment, but we need to make it. In democracies, in countries, voters vote according to identity, their identity, not based on interests. For example, the motto, "Make America Great Again." So we vote according to our identity. If we go to Poland and we celebrate the 20th anniversary of the accession to the EU, everyone is happy because the country has made great progress, and after 1 month they elected an anti-European president because Europe would be a risk for the great tradition of Poland. So again, we're going back to talking about roots. And this is a great change for humanity. Let us remember when Clinton said we are economic stupid, so we vote only according to economic reasoning. But a great step forward would be to have more relations based on concrete, real elements, so less theory, less philosophy. The world will have peace only if diversity is respected. That's the concept I would like to get across. So that's how I learned to make politics and how I think politics should be done. If you close dialogue, that's the end of the world. And I always say that everyone is very good at talking with St. Francis, but the problem is talking to the wolf. But if you don't talk to the wolf, then there is no peace in the world. That's why today's event is a meeting. It's beautiful because we are talking with diversity, including everyone and everything. And I remember some colleagues of mine believed it would be correct to stop studying Dostoevsky. And I said, are we going crazy? The world is being divided. And so even a feeble dialogue between China and the US, it's good enough. It's very weak. But I really hope it will make progress. It's a step forward, and we needed it. And Turkey is right in the middle of this dialogue. So, and I believe right in this palace, peace talks about the war in Ukraine were started. So maybe the time was not the correct one, but there was an attempt. And I must say, quite frankly, that I was a bit disappointed that the EU didn't make any such effort. Because if we had to think of a structure to bring about peace in the Ukraine, it would have been the EU. But due to the unanimity rule, the EU was paralyzed and didn't act. So these are the very simple changes that we have to make in order to have a better world. And let me repeat, we are not all the same, but we need to dialogue as peers. Thank you, Professor Prodi. We'll go back to the European responsibilities. The EU is not able to defend its own interests, for example, in the very early phases of the conflict between Russia and the Ukraine. So now I would like to ask Professor Erdogan, because we are here in this sacred place where the 2022 negotiation happened and failed, and then there was another negotiation in 2025, but the expectations were much smaller in this case in last spring. So do you know, what does the Turkish government know? What are the reasons for the failure of this negotiation? So in April 2022, thanks to the works of Turkish diplomacy and government, it seemed that it was shared by both sides. So what was the obstacle that arose that could not be overcome and that has been coming over and over again in the last 3.5 years? Well, of course, I'm not a member of the Turkish government. I am an external observer.
My observation can be, obviously, the talks in 2023, not in this building, but very near here on the Bosphorus, came to actually a very fruitful, very realistic conclusion. But from the public opinion and from what we have heard in Turkey is that Ukraine was pressured by some Europeans, especially Boris Johnson at the time. This is what we have heard, and what is spoken about is that Johnson pressured Zelensky not to accept. And I was recently in Georgia. I mean, this is to sort of support what has happened in Dolmabahce, very close to here. That Ukraine and Russia were very close to an agreement, and Turkey really did a great job there. Unfortunately, there was pressure on Ukraine, because I think some saw this as an opportunity to weaken Russia, you know, from the European perspective. I don't understand why Europe would want a weakened Russia. The only answer, historically, is that thinking of Russia as always a constant threat to Europe, right? And the European Union, maybe we forget, I don't know, but this is what I studied at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. Europe was founded on the principle of an ever closer union by making France and Germany so much intertwined in terms of all their interests, so that they will never actually threaten each other again, because they fought for so long. I mean, European wars were basically wars between France and Germany, and I just gave an example from 5 centuries ago. And the idea that these wars will be impossible if we make these countries so intertwined in terms of their interests. And this really was a great success. Europe Europe was successful for a long time, but at least we know that France and Germany probably very unlikely to go to war. I mean, nobody would question that, right? But after the First and Second World Wars, unfortunately, Russia was, the Soviet Union obviously was not thought of as, okay, how do we avoid another war between a European power and the Soviet Union or with Russia, was not thought through. And after the Cold War, my professor at Johns Hopkins, David Kaleo, was very critical in 2006 of European Union and NATO expansion to former Soviet republics. Because before then, in the first 10, 15 years of post-Cold War era, there were so many mechanisms to incorporate Russia into the EU mechanisms, into some NATO, cooperation, collaboration, etc. There were many dealings to incorporate Russia. So this was sort of remindful of what transpired between France and Germany. So you could argue by making Russia a part of Europe, an indispensable part of Europe, an indispensable part of West, because Russia is a Western power, right? Maybe we have forgotten that maybe throughout the last couple of years. But that wasn't, again, I might tie that into the lack of strategic vision from my first part of my speech. Unfortunately, both from the European Union perspective and from NATO being the American perspective, Russia was not incorporated, and increasingly, Professor Kaleo would say, encroaching upon Russian interests or the backyard of Russia would be threatening in the long run. And this is what happened. Basically, by pushing away Russia, this strategic lack of vision unfortunately brought us to the war in Ukraine. And the failure of the talks in Dolmabahce, I think, had to do with, again, I mean, the UK is no longer EU, but especially Johnson is what I heard from several sources, pressured the Ukrainians not to give in, not to accept that agreement. And I think we have to still think about a more macro, I mean, as Professor Prodi nicely put it, we are different, but we have shared interests as citizens of the world. As neighbors, we have more shared interests, and there are ways to walk around these things. I mean, academics and people in the international relations field, they put forward ideas where you can make sure that these interactions can work peacefully. But this, I want to come to my visit to Georgia. I realized how Georgia was treated in a similar manner in the last couple of years. The Georgians feel, I mean, although we have a political leadership in Georgia who are so European and pro-Western, now they are framed as pro-Russian, pro-Russian people. This is so interesting. And although they don't have any diplomatic relations with Russia throughout the last 17 years, Europe is pushing them, Russia is pushing them, and this country doesn't know what to do. A small country of 3 million, some Europeans thought, can wage war on Russia so that there will be two fronts and Russia will have a more difficult time. And this is incredible to think that a small country will do this for the sake of some European circles pressuring them to do. And again, let's just get back to what makes these troubles more difficult: by incorporation, by dialogue, by collaboration, by intertwining our interests together with each other. And I think this is, of course, a new round is much more difficult because things got much worse since then. But that strategic vision has to be there, and I agree with Professor Prodi how this, Baltic states, in the case of Georgia, are making life very hard for Georgia. But it begs the question: what has the Baltic states to do with Georgia? I mean, they are so far away. Why can we not start from the closest to Georgia, right, who are being affected? I mean, Turkey has the most to lose from EU's relations with Georgia, the most to lose from the war in Ukraine, the most to lose from the genocide in Palestine. So that's why Turkey is struggling in all these fronts to bring ceasefire, to bring a peace, to make it peaceful. And I think the role of Turkey and the President Erdogan is not appreciated enough throughout all these conflicts, and Europe has to, I mean, this week we had both prime ministers from the UK and Germany in Istanbul, I think there is now a realization that Europe needs to work with Turkey more regarding these conflicts, and I hope that gives us a glimmer of hope for the coming years.
Grazie per la sua franchezza.
Thank you very much for your honesty and frankness. You mentioned names and you mentioned the responsibility of Boris Johnson. We officially found out through interviews given 2 weeks ago of former Chancellor Merkel is that Boris Johnson, in sabotaging the outcome of the meetings in Istanbul 2022, was in good company because Mrs. Merkel mentioned that others were against the agreement, the Polish and the 3 Baltic states as well. Now, this is something that further stresses the responsibilities of the current European governance. A governance with a German president of the Commission, which has they have a lot of responsibility, and they blame the 3 smallest countries in the Union. Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia have the most important responsibilities. With the agreement of the European Parliament, a commission was named that is completely unbalanced in terms of the interests of the European people. The 3 countries I mentioned account for about 2-3% of the whole European population. So, now, as an observer, the impression is that there is not only, Mr. Prodi, the huge problem that you fought against starting from the end of the 90s, since you went to Brussels, namely the problem of the unanimity vote, but there's also a problem of culture when it comes to European interests. In the passage, in the shift between Trump 1 to Biden, at the time, Europe had a strategic and economic relationship signed by Macron and Merkel with the China of Xi Jinping. Europe also had gas at 10 instead of 42 from Russia. And of course, the money, the 42 is not paid to Russia, but to other suppliers. And also at the time, we were marginalized from the most decisive and relevant tables, which instead, there Europe should have been the main stakeholder behind the choices of the guidelines and the paths to follow to avoid ending up where we are now. Now the question is it a matter of culture, of inferiority? Macron said it before he became a supporter. So again, do we act as the servants of the Atlantic power, or is there just a sort of a negative trend? Someone say we are the new sleepwalkers of the 21st century. We have governors, as it happened in the First World War. It's a matter of lack of ability. They're not able to have a view and a vision of what might happen. Is that the case? When Europe decides that it gives 800 billion euro for rearmaments at the global level. And, we know that the European Union was created to avoid any further conflicts, as was the case in the previous century. Now we are using European money to rebuild and strengthen national armies supported by the national principles of their governments. Let's think of Germany and Poland. They have this muscly approach and want a stronger army. So is there going to be is it going to have a boomerang effect for Europe? Europe was created to destroy nationalisms, and now we are supporting nationalism through rearmaments. It's quite worrying, right? Well, we are going backwards if we think of the original intention of the European Union. The veto is used in many different cases. That's why I think that the unanimous vote is a tragedy. The Baltic countries veto the appeasement policy. Hungary does the opposite, and then they veto another type of policy. So the power of veto means that even small countries feel like giants, and that's the reality of things. I saw change in my life. I can just mention a couple of episodes. The last meeting of the summit of the European Union with the President and Russia, 2004, it was November. A Russian journalist from the most authoritative outlet asked me and Mr. Putin when Russia would join the European Union. They didn't ask if Russia would join the European Union, they asked when. That was the mood of the time. Of course, my answer was Russia is too big and we would have two capitals, but we are going to work together. Nevertheless, Putin interrupted and he said, of course, we're going to bring together vodka and caviar. I mentioned Italian products, but anyway, we're now 20 years down the line, but 20 years are not 1,000 years. We have gradually broken down everything. If I'm asked whose fault is it, well, I think that we had extremisms on both sides. The European weakness was very clear also in the relationships with the United States. So there was a sum of various weaknesses due to the problem of unanimity, as I said before. The reason is quite simple. We're not here to say it's Europe's fault. And I'm trying to be very straightforward. The European Union is a great success. It was great to bring together countries that were previously enemies, but nobody really likes the result. It's a half-cooked, half-raw bread. We need to cook it, put it in the oven, and instead there are some people who want to bring Europe backwards. Of course, the politics of the United States has also changed. I wasn't in line with President Bush, but he was European by definition. Even his jokes were European. Then Clinton came about. He did have a connection with Europe. Then we had Obama, and to him, Singapore and Copenhagen were exactly the same thing. So we started eroding a tie, and then Trump came. And Trump, of course, has put up a wall against Europe. Let's be clear, Trump only wants to talk to people who have full powers in their own countries. So, to Trump, democracy is something that is written in history books, but it's not something that is part of real life. It's not part of actual behaviors. So Europe is left to the sides by its historic ally, by the United States. And yet, I still strongly believe in the principles of Europe. I spent my entire life believing in Europe. It's about giving people democracy and power. And I think that it's on that we are going backwards. We need to just be honest and say it. We can only revert this trend if we can start a dialogue again, because otherwise we won't be able to stop the process. That's the simple truth, I believe, that we are experiencing today. Turkey plays a very important role in this whole context, because Turkey has a dialogue with many countries, with Sometimes it might be questionable. Let's be, again, honest and open. And yet, Turkey does have a very important role. Let's also acknowledge that if the dialogue between the two main world powers does not continue, then the role of the European Union or of Turkey can only be very limited. The world is going back to the old bipolarism, I think. The United States and the Soviet Union in the past, and now we're seeing the United States and China. This is a big problem, because if we go back to this bipolarism, there's no space for Turkey, there's no room for the European Union. So yes to dialogue, but we do need to participate actively and have a significant role. Even in economic terms, the European Union is not that far away from the United States. Let's take the nominal GDP for whatever it's worth, but 24% for the United States, 18% China, and 18% Europe. I mean, we're not that far away. We're not really lagging behind. So we do have the right conditions to play a significant role. The problem is that we need to be aware of it and use this strength and power. Turkey and Europe should have a dialogue. It can be confrontational as well, but let's have a dialogue. Let's respect each other's differences. Fair enough, that's fine. But we do need a relationship. It would be very useful right now, especially for the Mediterranean area, where there's a lot of chaos and continuous tragedies that are happening over and over again. And this has been going on for a very long time. Think of Syria, Lebanon, Palestine that you mentioned before, Mr. Erdogan. These are human tragedies. These are not tragedies that only hit those countries. It's a tragedy for the whole of humanity. We could play a role. We could cooperate. We haven't done it so far. And this, to me, is unfathomable. I just cannot understand why. Very quickly now, just another round, because we're getting close to the conclusions. Let's start from Mr. Erdogan on this view of possible bipolarism, a new bipolarism that is taking shape with the actors that have changed, China instead of the Soviet Union and the United States still being one of the two poles. In light of your critical assessment of the behaviors of Europe and the West in the last significant steps of the world history, my question is, in this context, how is Turkey located? It is a member of NATO, and at the same time, Turkey is very well aware that the West no longer represents the majority of the world's expectations.
So I think the bipolar world, if we, Professor Prodi indicated, it's going to be similar to the Cold War. During the Cold War, everybody had to pick sides. I think that was very problematic. That was especially problematic for Turkey, and we were on the NATO side, obviously. But throughout the Cold War, Turkey was not able to grow to its potential. And throughout those some 40-some years, unfortunately, I mean, I studied Turkey's and Italy's economies at the end of Second World War. We were very similar economies, very close in size, but Italy just took off, and Turkey unfortunately remained as a rural and heavily agricultural society throughout the Cold War years. So if we are going to talk about choosing sides to benefit you. I mean, as Professor indicated, increasingly less decisions are made based on interests, and identity politics are playing a bigger role here. Turkey unfortunately made a decision that didn't serve its interests throughout the Cold Year. So a country like Turkey shouldn't have to choose sides, because we're in the middle of everything, right? Everything going to sort of pass through us and affect us trade-wise, transportation-wise, the ports, the airports, the roads. We have one of the largest airports in the world because, I mean, thanks to Turkish Airlines, but also our location, obviously. So our interests, I think, mandates that we do not have to choose sides in a bipolar world. And the fact that Turkey is now an economy of $1.5 trillion, we are seen as a regional power anyways. So in this coming bipolar world, Turkey will have to make decisions based on her interests as a regional power, and I think this is sensible given the experience of the Cold War for Turkey. But in terms of the EU's strategic vision, I think not only the EU is having governance issues, all international bodies are having similar governance issues because of these dynamics of the transformation from a unipolar world to a multipolar or bipolar world. That is why if we can have a governance reform in the EU, we should have a governance reform in the UN as well. Turkey has been, under the leadership of President Erdogan, has been demanding a reform to the UN and arguing, the President always says the world is bigger than five. Just like the veto mechanism or a required unison in decisions in the EU, the veto power in the UN is blocking everything. The UN is not able to stop wars. The UN is not able to achieve peace. You know, other countries, I mean, Turkey was able to do something in Syria, not the EU, not the UN, right? And not the US even, because a regional power with close interest and the vicinity is actually more sensible to a real solution to any problem. That is why, and the genocide in Palestine too. I mean, the fact that the US has vetoed the latest UN Security Council resolution against 14 votes. I mean, this is incredible. This is the US against 14. And much of that 14 is also West and Western powers, including 4 members of the UN Security Council of the 5. So that is why I think to instill again a new power to these international organizations, obviously we need a rule-based international system again. We have lost that. And to erect a new rule-based international system, given the new circumstances of a bipolar or a multipolar world, I think the decision-making mechanisms have to be revised with representation of more continents and more civilizations. Let's say, I mean, 2 billion, close to 2 billion Muslims are not represented in the UN Security Council 5, right? So we can understand why Muslim world has been suffering through various infighting and civil wars and the latest genocide. And look what's happening in Sudan nowadays. I mean, there needs to be a representation of the Muslim world in world decision-making bodies. And obviously, I have to say this, I mean, although it's not one of our agenda items today, because it's so close to our hearts in Turkey, Israel has to be held responsible for this genocide. Not only at ICC or ICJ, it has to be held responsible by having to pay reparations for the Palestinians. I mean, to demolish all infrastructure for 2 million people, and then for Muslim countries to come to rebuild it. This is not fair. And because if the Muslim countries come back to rebuild it, Israel is going to demolish it again. So I think Israel has to rebuild Gaza. Even if it's $70 billion, even if it's $100 billion, Israel has to rebuild, pay for the rebuilding of Gaza so that they will not undertake this sort of genocide and crimes against humanity again. And I hope that we can agree upon these things, because these are the minimum that makes us human. I think really I was going to talk a lot about culture going forward, and you know, preserving culture and heritage, and how it is important in preserving our humaneness. You know, with robotics and artificial intelligence, increasingly the question in movies is whether the robots or the AI is going to take over our livelihoods. But I think the problem is not that. The problem is we are losing our humane nature. Increasingly, we are becoming robots, and we are making decisions based on algorithms that do not take their inspiration from our culture and our humane nature, which has to have compassion, right? Which has to have love in the center of things. And that, I think, increasingly is being eroded in this day and age. And I hope that we have to, I mean, at least we should be able to avoid the next genocide by making sure the outcome of what has transpired in Palestine is really rightful and takes the criminal country behind this, makes them responsible and pay for their crimes. And I hope we can start investing for the building blocks of a rule-based international system again. And I hope Europe will play a part in that, and I hope Turkey will definitely play a part in that. Thank you.
Gli organismi sovranazionali sono decisamente in
So,
crisi.
international organizations are definitely undergoing a crisis, and for sure the G7 has almost disappeared. And at the same time, more attention is focused on other groups, such as the BRICS. A few months ago, we saw the Shanghai conference organize a meeting including more than half of the representatives of the world's population. So the world the question is the same that we asked ourselves in 2008 at the beginning of the Obama era. Are we heading towards the end of the G7, back then G8 logic, and are we heading towards a G2 logic, or will the intermediate powers have to impose a larger group that can jointly take decisions for the whole of the globe? Well, let me say that the G7 doesn't exist anymore. The G7 meetings are just as important as a folkloristic meeting. You can't make any decisions when China is not there, and when more than half of the world is not represented. So that's reality, that's the situation. And I lived through the decline of the G7 importance, even when it went from G8 to G7, because the world has changed and the G7 hasn't changed. There was an attempt made with the G20, but it's still not strong enough, and that's a problem of reorganizing international structures. We're still very, very far from a solution, to be frank. We cannot say that there we will shortly have a reform of the UN. It's not possible. Yet we need to consider that the world has changed. Maybe because I'm an economist, I must say that we're now in 2025, and 21 years ago, well, let's say 20 years ago, in 2004-5, there were 200 countries in the world, and 150 of them traded more with the US than with China. Now it's exactly the opposite within the UN. So only 50 countries trade with the US and 150 with China. So the world is upside down from that perspective, and that must be taken into account by institutions. But up to date, the international institutions are not being replaced. They are declining year after year and not being replaced. So we are going back to a new bipolarism. Actually, we've never spoken, but we agree, because these are the facts. And when before I said that I'm happy we are having a dialogue, I meant it because it is one thing to have a dialogue based on tension, and another thing it is to have a bilateral dialogue without tension, where there is a meeting and an actual discussion. So yesterday's meeting makes me happy because that was a bilateral meeting where they had some talks, and that's already progress. But for now, I am seeing no further development besides that. And one last comment, Professor Erdogan talked about Turkey as a regional power, and rightly so. I think this brings about some tension in the relationship between the EU and Turkey, because Turkey has interests that are seen as divergent, and rightly so. But we haven't put into place a situation, an organism a body where we can have a continuous dialogue. We should do much more in that sense. It would be a very powerful and useful tool, because Turkey is a regional power, Europe is too. They have some goals, majority of which are shared, but there are some differences. So if there is no talk, the differences will be the only criterion based on which we will have a relationship, and that's what's happening right now. So a concrete step we should take is precisely that. And maybe some people may say that it's nothing, it's not really a lot, but no, this is a step in the direction of a much bigger work. And I believe that, well, we've never had big tensions, actually, maybe some misunderstanding. So after a period of, let's call them misunderstandings, we should set ourselves some shared goals on certain issues. The dramatic situation in Gaza, for example, is the actual situation currently. That's what we have now. So why can't we undertake joint initiatives, for example, as regards this situation that is right there in the Mediterranean? It's not in Latin America, it's right there between us. So an active dialogue on these topics is needed, and the fact that it's lacking, I think it's very damaging for both. This is the concrete step we should take, in my opinion. Thank you. Thank you, Professor Prodi. Thank you, Professor Erdogan. Now the first session for today is now reaching its close. Now we'll leave the floor to the second session and the moderator, Mark Anton.